When you say the word talent, the first actor that comes to my mind is, I'm waiting for you to say the word talent here, it's Danny Kaye. Of course, he wasn't really that great at acting, but he was amazing at everything else, including several non-show business skills such as flying an airplane, cooking food, conducting an orchestra. It's possible that his prowess at some of these things was exaggerated a little bit because he was a celebrity, but either way, what a remarkable guy. What an interesting guy. We'll talk a lot about him in this video. During the golden age of Hollywood, there was more emphasis on this kind of star talent, on going to the theaters, paying your money to see something that you couldn't see anywhere else, some kind of magical performance, and I miss that. But don't worry, the magic, it's still there on film, and if you haven't seen anything with Danny Kaye in it, you got to. Probably your first stop should be The Court Jester. That's basically the perfect classic comedy, and it's an absolute joy to watch. The Court Jester, an amazing movie. But what about The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, a film, the title of which, it might ring a bell because it was remade in 2013 with Ben Stiller. Danny Kaye to Ben Stiller. It's not an upgrade. I didn't know what to really expect from the original, other than the few pieces I'd gleaned from the trailer, which I saw circa 2013. And yeah, from the trailer, it makes it seem like, it's a movie about a guy with a boring corporate job. Wonder what that's like. And he starts traveling the world to be alive, to break the mold, to break out of the daily grind, and to feel something or whatever. These are the myths of our current era, but how would that story play out in the 1940s? That was kind of what I came into the movie thinking. It turns out that the original story is quite a bit different, which perhaps makes sense. We'll talk about that a lot more. Before we go any farther, though, yes, the original is way better, way better than the remake, and I strongly recommend this movie. Now, the new movie, it does have some ambitions. It has some nice special effects, and it has a couple of clever moments, but it's also almost unrelentingly mediocre. Kind of a pale attempt at something like Eternal Sunshine, really, is maybe its closest kind of comparison. I found it pretty hard to watch the movie, and honestly, I resorted to skimming through large sections of it, but we're not reviewing the new one, we're reviewing the old one. And with the 1947 film, things could not be more different. Like I said, I went in with this historical curiosity a little bit. I went in with a bit of an intellectual purpose, but I quickly realized that there's no need to bring any agenda to this movie. This is a movie, a film you can just sit down and watch. It's really fun, and there's also a lot of interesting stuff going on. You don't need a magnifying glass to find it. It will come and hit you in the face. The movie is also, it feels pretty darn fresh, and I think it was a bit ahead of its time in some ways that I will explain. There are plenty of older comedies. Plenty, believe me. We've covered some of them on this channel. Plenty of older comedies that you might not even realize are comedies if you didn't know ahead of time. If you didn't look at the little genre thing on IMDb, you wouldn't really know what they're trying to do in the movie. Was that an attempt at humor? Was that a joke? There's usually a decrease in hilarity of about 5% per decade. I don't know the exact numbers, obviously, but the point is that this movie really bucks that trend and is genuinely hilarious. At least I found it funny, and has a lot of zing even now, feels so fresh. There are a lot of different types of jokes in the movie, of course. There's some really goofy stuff, and there's some really clever stuff as well. It's a really tightly put together movie, when it needs to be. Really great story and plot. There's also some kind of absurd stuff that feels more like a meme that you would see today. I love seeing kind of absurdist comedy in old movies because it reminds you that, hey, it wasn't, even in the 40s, it wasn't like everybody just walking around telling knock-knock jokes. Like there was irony and absurdism the exact same way that there was today. There was the subversive and unexpected nature of comedy was the same back then as it is now, and that's pretty cool. One of Danny Kaye's trademarks is a feeling of quaint ridiculousness, sort of a charming ridiculousness that's always kind of winking at the audience a little bit, always slightly self-aware, kind of like a skit almost that the actors know is a little bit ridiculous. His brand might not be totally familiar to you, and it might just feel a bit goofy, maybe even too goofy, but I think you'll still like the movie. I think you'll still laugh at it, and you'll still feel the charm. Ironically, Danny Kaye could be pretty hard to work with, but in the movies, on the screen, he is so warm. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty really does not feel like it came out 78 years ago. And yeah, the amount of life that it has in it, despite being so old, is fascinating and really, really engaging. Okay, just so we're on the same page, the basic idea of this movie is that Danny Kaye, Walter Mitty, is a guy living with his mother in New Jersey. He commutes into Manhattan every day to work at a publishing company. Yup, this is a New York movie, partly a New Jersey movie, but we'll overlook that part. This publishing company mainly does pulp fiction. Walter Mitty likes to daydream, and this is one of the defining mechanics of the film, him constantly slipping away into fantasy. And you see the fantasy in the movie. This happens almost a little too abruptly right at the beginning, sets the tone. Hey, he's going to be fantasizing in this movie. You're going to be going along with him for the ride. It keeps happening throughout. It's a clever mechanism, really, because it allows a lot of the film to be Danny Kaye doing various skits, right? He pretends to be a doctor at one point. He's asking for various ridiculous implements at the table. Watering can, knitting needles. It's good stuff. We have an Old West showdown later in the film, a high-stakes poker game. He gives a musical performance at one point while daydreaming about being a British officer during the war. I don't love the song here exactly, but it's pretty good. Generally, Danny Kaye's comedy songs, many of which were written by his wife, I think, his comedy songs generally are still, even today, pretty funny, despite that kind of thing being totally out of fashion. His performances here are also impressive. He's got long takes of him, skipping through all these really complicated verses and lyrics. That would, of course, be a hallmark of a lot of his films, actually. His delivery, his verbal prestidigitation, the skill with the mouth. He was basically the first rapper. No, he wasn't. Anyway, two interesting things about this scene with the music. First, it's indicating towards the war. We'll come back to that later, how this functions as a post-war movie. And second, he's imitating an old professor with some kind of Jewish coding to it. Danny Kaye, David Daniel Kaminsky, from right up the road in Brooklyn, New York, was Jewish, and Jewish paternal and maternal figures show up in just about all of his work. I don't love every single skit in the movie, but the mechanic works well here. There's a good balance between the plot that will slowly start to emerge and all of these little sort of scenes and skits. The transitions between the real and the fantasy are also great. In Walter's dreams, he tends to be daring and courageous, but then he snaps back to reality and tends to be the opposite. If you've seen The Court Jester, you'll have seen Danny Kaye switching between different characters there too, another thing he did in a lot of his movies. There's a really elegant dynamic in this movie where most of the fantasies feature the same sound effect, the sound, tapakata, tapakata. They skipped over the Foley department for these sound effects and just recorded someone's voice saying tapakata, exactly like that. There's some really early audio processing on it. I'm actually very curious how they manipulated the sound back then in 1947. Cool effect. Can you name another movie from the 1940s that uses voices to create sound effects? Voices to create sound effects. How about A Letter to Three Wives from 1949, where they give a voice to the water dripping from the sink with some kind of, it's like an early vocoder-like technology. That's kind of an interesting movie. In The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, the style of the daydream sequences is really cool, and this is one of the places where the movie feels a little ahead of its time. These dreams are mainly shot on sound stages that you don't really have backgrounds. It's an embellished style and kind of weird staging. There's slick transitions in and out. We're mainly reading from the playbook of musical numbers here. I mean, you would find all of these things in musical numbers back in the 1930s even. But these aren't song and dance for the most part, and they feel a little bit different. If you had shown me some of these clips from the movie with its glitzy style and asked me, what year is this from? I would have probably said 1957, but it's 1947. Hey, that's got to be worth something, right? Maybe I just am not that great at estimating it. But to me, this, like I said, felt a little bit ahead of its time. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking, but it feels fresh. There are some cool themes here as well with these dreams. I like the idea of adults using their imagination. This is a lot more common in movies about children. I mean, almost all movies about children invoke the imagination pretty explicitly. Some movies about big rapids also feature this. The 1940s was mainly a time of gendered cinema, hard-boiled noir films for men, and tear-jerking women's pictures for women's pictures. This is not either one of those things, and we'll come back and talk a lot about Danny Kaye and his masculine, his flavor of masculinity, Danny Kaye and gender, basically. I think one of the reasons this movie still feels fresh is because of the vulnerability that he shows, how he skips past some of those stereotypes. An adult daydreamer is an empathetic character, kind of in touch with childhood and kind of in touch with entertainment, with something fanciful. Another theme here, of course, is escapism. Escapism was an inherent theme of most classic Hollywood films. Some invoke it more directly, like the fantastic movie Sullivan's Travels. What a great movie. We double down on escapism here because Walter works at a publishing company, this pulp fiction company, making pocket editions for people to read on the go. So far, we've only talked about the movie at the highest level, the basics of the plot, but there are already tons of interesting things coming up. And we've got a big backlog of things to revisit here, so let's get to it. Let's start back at the beginning of the movie, though. One of the first things you'll notice is how the film positions itself towards consumerism. Walter's mother is very particular about the type of soap she wants him to pick up in the city. It's called Sea Drift. And they drive past a big billboard for it, and there's a ship on the billboard with going through these big waves, and that is what triggers Walter's first daydream. One detail here is that when we go into these dreams, we go with Walter. We miss out on whatever is really happening. The dreams are privileged in this way, and when he snaps back to reality, and his mother asks him, "Weren't you listening at all? What did I just tell you?" Walter doesn't know, and you also don't know as the audience. The movie actually starts right after Walter's mother has said something she finds important. It starts with them sort of zoning out, and then she says, "Hey, were you even listening at all?" And again, we aren't really privy to what was said by his mother, this time, not because we were in a dream with him, but simply because the movie hadn't started. That's kind of interesting. This sort of daydream mechanic wasn't super common at the time. Nowadays, there's tons of grammar to pull from for this sort of thing, but it's interesting to see how they set all these things up in this movie. Don't worry, there are no harp sounds, just tapakada, tapakada, tapakada. Anyway, the soap takes us to our first daydream, but it is also the first piece of satirical product placement in the movie, the first of many, really. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is by no means a radical movie, but as a comedy, it has some subversive aspects to it. And one of those is a gentle satire of 1940s consumerism. This is another thing that maybe we'd be more used to seeing in 1950s movies when Geritol was presenting 21. In fact, just about every show had a goofy sponsor. In 1947, television was picking up, but it was still early days. There were not as many glitzy consumerist films at the time, although there were a lot of movies about advertising, about sloganeering. And of course, there was a lot of advertising and a lot of product placement all over the place. Anyway, this movie feels a couple years ahead of the curve again here. And yeah, the consumer angle goes well beyond one billboard. Walter's mom, a few minutes later, lists out a bunch of other goofy stuff they need, other products, brand names, right? The brand, right? Not just pick up soap, but pick up this brand of soap. The idea of a brand being an important thing, part of this consumerist wave that was rising after the war. The fact that his mother knows all these things is modeling a certain type of suburban expertise, I guess. Maybe the most extreme example of this consumerist stuff comes later when Walter visits a department store, the nexus of sort of post-war consumerism. There is also a little fashion show in the movie. I think this is connected to the department store. I forget exactly. In the 40s and the 50s, gowns from movies would often be available in stores after the movies came out. Studios put a lot of effort into this kind of marketing connections from movie into like Macy's or whatever. They made a lot of films into one big fashion show, basically. There's an interesting doubleness to a fashion show, then, that is inside of a movie. The movie's kind of already a fashion show. Hey, you've got a fashion show inside of it, kind of a celebration of consumerism in some ways. This movie is not the only one to do that. Probably the most famous example is a movie called The Women from 1939, a movie with a lot of cattiness in it. That was part of the charm at the time. A bit like Stage Door, but worse, as I recall. It's been a long time since I watched either one of those. I think Stage Door is also from 1939, too, La Cava or whatever. That's a pretty cool movie. Anyway, The Women is in black and white, except for one scene, which is the Technicolor fashion show. A lot of movies then and now were celebrations of the mainstream and the modern, celebrations of consumerism, forefronting the act of consumption, modeling how the viewers might do it as well. In The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, the fashion show is more of a spoof, again, sending up consumer culture. Not radical, but kind of fun. You probably get the picture here. This is a conspicuous theme throughout the movie. Another interesting theme that I've already alluded to a little bit is the suburban versus the urban life, the suburbs versus the city. This is a commuter movie, so first, yeah, it conjures up something like Sunrise, A Tale of Two Humans, maybe the ultimate film about the urban and the rural, really, there, other than Country Mouse and City Mouse, of course. Both of those, you can find them on YouTube these days. Walter, in this movie, is engaged to be married to someone in Perth Amboy. That's not in Australia, it's in New Jersey. And that's where he lives with his mom. Small society, feels kind of suburban, maybe even rural. His fiancée is named Gertrude. Her mother is named Eunice, or maybe it's the other way around, I forget. She has a dog named Queenie. They're kind of laying it on a little bit with the suburban life here, right? They're kind of poking fun at a certain type of traditional America just with those names alone. When we go to the city, on the other hand, we've got a hectic environment. We have some classic office imagery with the packed elevators. It recalls something like The Apartment. These are images you could find in a ton of these movies. Or another example from earlier, The Crowd, King Vidor's The Crowd. Great movie about sort of urban alienation. There is also, in the city, just a little hint of ethnic diversity. Not much, but Walter meets some Dutch people and some other vaguely foreign-coded types, I would say. So, yeah, there's a push and a pull between the suburb and the city in this movie. But as someone who lives in New York City and commuted for quite a while, I'm struck by something a little bit different, which is just how convenient the whole arrangement is cinematically. It allows us to have a suburban domestic life, which was really the currency of classic Hollywood, the suburban domesticity. Well, that's here, right? But it also has something more dynamic and adventurous. You see something similar play out in most commuter movies, really. Think of, like, the Dick Van Dyke Show. Even though we never really see them on the streets of New York City, the workplace storylines there are extremely urban, things that could really only happen in New York in some ways. But we also have the idyllic New Rochelle house that Robert Petrie can return to. Idyllic New Rochelle house, idyllic New Rochelle house wife. And conveniently, Petrie, he can travel between these two locations instantaneously. Isn't that nice? In real life, commuting is not that fun, which isn't to say that you can't have a nice life like this. But you do wonder, which came first, the commuter myths, like in this movie, or the actual commuters? Probably they evolved together. In this movie, the commuter myth is particularly incoherent. We have stuff in Midtown Manhattan. We have the suburbs as well, like I said, and we do get some scenes on the train into the city. That creates like this logical connection between them, and there are a couple cab rides as well. So there is some logic here, but Walter really zips between these locations at will. Even when he has to carry a clock or a rake into the city, it reminds you a little bit of the oar in the 7-Year Itch. There are people from the city that somehow find Walter's house in New Jersey. That doesn't really make sense. There are also a couple other locations that come up, like some really big houses, and you can find big houses in parts of New York, believe me, but the movie doesn't really even try to tell us where these things are. It kind of looks like a Hollywood backlot. It's interesting how this movie is split between something that looks like a Hollywood backlot and something that is unmistakably New York City. There are a couple of cool shots outside on the streets in the 40s in New York, and these are one of the things that make the movie, again, feel kind of fresh, feel like some zing, feel like there's some real life going on. Generally, the commuter myth in this movie, the geography, it doesn't really feel right. There's more stuff we could talk about here, like the cars, or Danny Kaye's obsession with coming in through windows. Not the only movie where he keeps coming in through the windows, kind of the opposite of Audrey Hepburn. But let's keep moving. 1946 was probably Hollywood's biggest ever year. You'll see estimates that more than 90 million people went to the movies each week in 1946, that more than 4 billion tickets were sold in 1946, and it's not hard to imagine why. The war was over, right? People had more time, more money, and more inclination. One of the biggest films of that year was The Best Years of Our Lives, which stars Virginia Mayo, who is also in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. I want to give a shout out to Virginia Mayo. I don't think she's watching, but, you know, interesting actress, because I don't think that she's much of a household name today. I don't think, even to me, I don't think, like, when I hear the name, I'm not sure I distinguish Virginia Mayo a lot from other actresses, but man, she was in some great movies like The Best Years of Our Life, and a bunch of movies with Danny Kaye, and White Heat as well, which is, wow, White Heat, what a great movie. I remember in college, I think my film studies textbook had White Heat on the front of it, and I was like, what the heck is this movie? Why'd they pick this one? And then I watched it, and I thought, oh, what a great movie. Anyway, maybe not remembered with the same distinctions as some of her peers, but cool actress. The Best Years of Our Lives was about soldiers returning from the war. It came out in 1946, and a lot of people returning from the war went to see it. This was the defining story of the time. 1 year later, and people were still thinking about it. We see a lot of traces of the war in this movie, too. The main plot of the film, besides all the daydreaming, is about recovering artifacts scattered by the war. We have one of the dream sequences where Danny Kaye is a British fighter pilot. Interesting that he's British and not American in this. Probably this helps everything feel a little bit more fun. He gets to pull out his British accent, sort of coating the whole thing with this like campy fun kind of feel. And there's a little bit more distance and detachment from the war itself, I guess. I don't have a lot more to say about the war, but it's an unmistakable aspect of the film. I think a lot of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, the suburbs, the consumerism, all this, these were to some degree post-war things, and we've got a snapshot of that here. It might not exactly feel like it at first, but I think this movie is defined by coming out a couple years after the war ended, which in some ways is no surprise. Okay, the last major topic I want to address is gender. No matter how hard-boiled you might be, I think you'll see that Danny Kaye is doing something interesting in this movie and throughout his career. I mentioned already that this was a time mostly of pretty extreme gendered cinema, right? Danny Kaye's characters are often pretty tender, not really fitting into that. If he is adopting more masculine images in his movies, it's usually part of a bit, right? It's a dream sequence, and he's about to wake up and go back to being himself. He's going to snap out of it and go back to being, himself. In The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, we have a pretty traditional American man, but it's not Walter Mitty. It's his fiance's suitor, Tubby. And the movie makes it pretty clear that Tubby and Walter are not doing the same thing, where Tubby talks about little black books and always has a proposition on his mind. Walter is innocent and almost childlike. That's a word that comes up a fair amount with Danny Kaye, I guess. Walter lives with his mother. Is he a mama's boy? That was a term that was much more prominent in the past, I think. He seems fairly annoyed with his mother most of the time, and believe me, being annoyed with his mother is a good little dramatic dynamo in the movie. He seems pretty annoyed by her most of the time, but he does kiss her on the mouth. I didn't quite know what to make of that. I think some people's reflex here is to fire up their web browser and type, "Was Danny Kaye straight?" into Google. I'm not really interested in a tabloid investigation, and spoiler alert, there's no real evidence. But if you watch the movies, clearly something non-traditional was going on. Clearly something's happening, right? Maybe Danny Kaye was just a family entertainer who had a style that was geared towards women and children to a large degree, a style that was fanciful and flamboyant, right? Riffing on the masculine images of the day, right? That could be it. On the other hand, I would be surprised if he wasn't aware how he was perceived in the world, and if he wasn't, if to some degree he wasn't, standing up for something with the way that he presented himself. I'm not sure. In The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, he does have a song at one point about Anatole of Paris. And he's playing a fashion designer here, Anatole of Paris. This is in connection with the fashion show that I mentioned earlier. The number ends with him saying he doesn't like women, in reference to the goofy hats that he designs for them, that he makes them wear. This character seems pretty clearly queer-coded, possibly just a riff on the stereotypes of the time. I mean, in some ways, not really even that positive of a thing to have in the movie, but I don't know, maybe something else as well. I don't have a big claim to make here. Danny Kaye doesn't smash all the formulas. Clearly, the film works towards couple formation, just like almost any classic movie. But for me, Danny Kaye's tenderness is striking, and it's one of these things that I think helps the film feel alive. It's cool to watch an old movie that still zings, and yeah, this one's got some zing. Let me leave with two things. First of all, Danny Kaye was a massive star in the 40s and in the 50s, but his career diminished somewhat later on. He did a lot of television. Why was this? Why did his career, ebb slightly? Did his affect work against him? Like I said, he was slotted in a pretty particular place in the culture. Did his affect work against him as time went by? Did times change? Was he too wedded to vaudeville, not in sync with modern stuff, the upheaval in the 1960s. Probably a lot of different things could be true. Was he just too mean and hard to work with? That's what some people say. It redoubles the idea that this movie was, for the moment, was a movie of that time. And it's interesting that for some reason, it couldn't last. That's an interesting thing to think about as you watch this. One word on the sequel now. Just one word on the sequel. Meh. The new one and the old one share the idea of daydreaming. But the sequel also has a bunch of stuff in it about following your dreams, which is not quite the same thing. That seems like it's really the main tenor of the film, breaking out of boring corporate life. That's not in the original movie. One of the most interesting things about the original is what isn't there, right? Is the fact that we don't really have that same yearning to be free of like corporate life. What was Walter striving for in 1947? Well, there's a dramatic plot to contend with. There's an impetus for couple formation. It seems like he kind of wants to get together. And there's a little bit of him maybe overcoming his timidity. Ben Stiller tries to do that too, but he does it by actually traveling across the world, by actually going on a big adventure, seizing the day. Danny Kaye doesn't do this. He's forced into action a little bit, but he never leaves the tri-state area. He doesn't need a travel agent to complete his American dream. He doesn't leave his job. In fact, he seems mostly to enjoy his job. There's different ways to read this. But here's what I'll say to you. I know that you have sometimes felt the way that the new Walter Mitty does, especially if you're in my generation. I know that you have felt like, I've got to get out of this place. I'm wasting my life. I'm not really living. I got to go on a big trip. If it were 1947, would you still feel that way?